Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I am Sentinel Hamby of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, United States Army, Guard of Honor, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The ceremony that you are about to witness is the changing of the guard. In keeping with the dignity of this ceremony, it is requested that everyone remain silent and standing. Thank you. Forward! March! Guards! Halt! Forward! March! Guards! Halt! March! Arms! Ready! Face! Reset! Arms! March! Arms! Ready! Face! Pass! On your orders!
Hold! And orders! Remain as directed. Orders! Acknowledged!
Ready! Face! Reset! Arms! March! Shoulder! Arm! Close! Right! Face! Forward! March!
Page 69. Page 68 was skipped, but is available online. Immediately following the federal court's rejection of the legal basis for the conspirators' plan, CC2 went to the meeting that the defendant had requested that Pence's staff, P58 and P8 take. At the outset, CC2 changed his tack and advocated that Pence simply reject the Biden electors outright. This was contrary to his primary recommendation the day before for Pence to send the slates to the state legislatures, but consistent with the preference the defendant had expressed. CC2 made additional concessions during this meeting. For example, CC2 agreed that the Supreme Court would unanimously reject his proposed action. Consistent historical practice since the founding was that the vice president never asserted authority to reject electors. No reasonable person would want the Constitution read that way because the office would never switch political parties. No state legislature appeared poised to try to change its electors, and if Democrats were to claim the same authority, CC2 would not credit it. P58 expressed to CC2 that the defendant's plan would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Page 70. P58 expressed to CC2 that the defendant's plan would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Having failed to enlist P58 in the criminal conspiracy, CC2 told him that the team was going to be really disappointed. The team, in fact, was disappointed. After CC2 updated CC1 on the meeting, CC6 confirmed to P1 that the Pence lawyer, that is, P58, was totally against us, prompting P1 to respond, "Fuck his lawyer." That same day, CC2 received an email confirming what he already had admitted to P58: no chamber of any legislature in any state, including Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, was requesting that its electoral votes be returned to the state for review. Meanwhile, CC5, who had traveled to Washington as directed by the defendant's public messages, obtained duplicate originals of the fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which they believed had not been delivered by mail to the president of the Senate or archivist. CC5 reviewed these duplicates from campaign staff and surrogates, who flew them to Washington at private expense. Page 71. He then hand-delivered them to staffers for a U.S. representative at the Capitol as part of a plan to deliver them to Pence for use in the certification proceeding. The defendant did not leave the pressure campaign to his co-conspirators. He redoubled his own efforts. On January 5th at 1:06 a.m., shortly before meeting with CC2, the defendant tweeted, "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors and designate the defendant as the winner of the Electoral College vote." That afternoon, the defendant met privately with Pence in the Oval Office. During the meeting, the defendant once again told Pence, "I think you have the power to decertify." When Pence was unmoved, the defendant threatened to criticize him publicly. "I'm gonna have to say you did a great disservice." This concerned P8, to whom Pence had relayed the defendant's threat, to the point that he alerted Pence's Secret Service detail. Next still, the defendant initiated a phone call with Pence, P8, P58, and CC3 and one or two other private attorneys, likely including CC1, and again raised the scenario of the vice president sending the elector slates to state legislatures. P58 again pointed out that such a strategy violated the ECA, and Pence reaffirmed that he did not believe he had the authority to do so. Page 72. Shortly after the call that evening at 5:43 p.m., the defendant tweeted, "I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds." The defendant continued his pressure campaign on Pence that evening. After a New York Times article that night detailed the afternoon's private conversation in which Pence had rejected the defendant's demand to act unlawfully, the defendant directed P4 to issue a statement rebutting it and approved the statement at 9:28 p.m. Minutes later, the defendant called Pence and told him, "You gotta be tough tomorrow." After concluding the call with Pence, the defendant sequentially spoke to P1 followed by CC2. Then, at around 10 p.m. that night, the defendant issued the public statement, which read, The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. A statement that the defendant knew was a lie from Pence's repeated and firm rejections of his efforts, but that gave false hope to the defendant's supporters arriving in the city at the defendant's request, and maximized pressure on Pence. The defendant caused unlawful conduct on January 6th and tried to take advantage of the riot that ensued. The defendant continued his intense pressure campaign against the vice president into the early morning hours of January 6th. Around 1 a.m., the defendant tweeted, falsely, "If Vice President at Mike_Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency." Page 73. If Vice President at Mike_Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back. At 8:17 a.m., as the supporters he had summoned to the city gathered near the White House, the defendant again falsely tweeted about the certification. States want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud. Plus, corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. Later that morning, CC5 worked with another attorney for the defendant, who contacted a U.S. senator to ask him to obtain the fraudulent Wisconsin and Michigan documents from the U.S. Representative's office and hand-deliver them to the vice president. When one of the U.S. Senator's staffers contacted a Pence staffer by text message to arrange for delivery of what the U.S. Senator's staffer had been told were alternate slate of electors for MI and WI because the archivist didn't receive them, Pence's staffer rejected them. At 11:15 a.m., shortly before traveling to the Ellipse to speak to his supporters, the defendant called Pence and made one last attempt to induce him to act unlawfully in the upcoming session. When Pence again refused and told the defendant that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceeding confirming that he lacked the authority to do what the defendant wanted, the defendant was incensed. Page 74. When Pence again refused and told the defendant that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceeding confirming that he lacked the authority to do what the defendant wanted, the defendant was incensed. He decided to reinsert into his campaign speech at the Ellipse remarks targeting Pence for his refusal to misuse his role in the certification. And the defendant set into motion the last plan in furtherance of his conspiracies. If Pence would not do as he asked, the defendant needed to find another way to prevent the certification of Biden as president. So on January 6th, the defendant sent to the Capitol a crowd of angry supporters, whom the defendant had called to the city and inundated with false claims of outcome-determinative election fraud, to induce Pence not to certify the legitimate electoral votes and to obstruct the certification. At the Ellipse campaign rally, CC1 and CC2 spoke just before the defendant. In his rally speech, CC1 sought to cloak the conspiracies in an air of legitimacy, assuring the defendant's supporters that every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal, and introduced CC2 as a preeminent constitutional scholar who would further explain this plan. Page 75. He, CC2, falsely claimed that legislatures in 5 states were begging to have their electoral ballots returned. CC1 then asserted that Pence could decide on the validity of these crooked ballots and told the crowd, "Let's have trial by combat." CC2 in his speech claimed that Pence must send electoral votes to state legislatures for the American people to know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not, and decried that we no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. When the defendant took the stage at the Ellipse rally to speak to the supporters who had gathered there at his urging, he knew that Pence had refused, once and for all, to use the defendant's fraudulent electors' certificates. The defendant also knew that he had only one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president, the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, the defendant delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march to the Capitol building. Skipped pages 76 through 80. The indictment is available. Page 80. And at approximately 2:24 p.m., Fox News reported that a police officer may have been injured and that protesters have made their way inside the Capitol. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in his dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. Page 81. That afternoon, at the Capitol, a rioter used a bullhorn to read the defendant's tweet about the vice president aloud to the crowd trying to gain entry to the building. The defendant issued the incendiary tweet about Pence despite knowing, as he would later admit in an interview in 2023, that his supporters listened to him like no one else. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secure location. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence, where is Pence? Bring him out," and "Traitor Pence." Several rioters in those chanting crowds wore hats and carried flags evidencing their allegiance to the defendant. In the years since January 6th, the defendant has refused to take responsibility for putting Pence in danger, instead blaming Pence. On March 13, 2023, he said, had Mike Pence sent the votes back to the legislatures, they wouldn't have had a problem with January 6th, so in many ways you can blame him for January 6th. Had he sent them back to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the states, I believe, number one, you would have had a different outcome. But I also believe you wouldn't have had Jan. 6 as we call it.